Hi, everyone. We're going to begin our section on the features of the face. What I'd like to start with are the eyes. The eyes in the animal world can be incredibly complex, but equally fascinating. So, typically speaking, there are three types of vision in the animal kingdom. There's binocular vision, monocular vision, and compound vision. Humans and the greater primates and a number of mammals, it varies, but typically have binocular vision. That's the eyes are usually in the front of our head. It gives us a great deal of the ability to see with depth and so forth. A lot of the wading birds and different sorts of birds have monocular vision, which means their eyes are on the side. And in many cases, the eyes can actually work independent of each other. They don't have a great sense of depth perception, but they have the capacity to see almost 360 degrees with eyes moving and working independently of each other. So they are typically animals that are prey animals, and so out of a sense of protection and survival, they have the ability to see all around them. The most common type of vision in the animal world is compound vision, and almost all insects, basically all insects, have compound vision. We're not going to talk too much about that today, and later in the year we'll talk more. When we get to the animals, we'll talk more specifically about a variety of the different animals and characteristics, but I just wanted to touch on it very briefly. So there's binocular vision, monocular vision, compound vision. Pupils, which is the dark portion of our eye, typically are either circular or, in the case, predators have circular pupils usually. Ambush predators would have non-circular vertical slits, and animals that are prey or grazing animals would have non-circular horizontal slits. So that would be like sheep, goats, elk, deer, anything that grazes would have non-circular horizontal slits or horizontal shaped pupils. Cats, fox, things of that nature can have vertical slits. Actually, on an interesting side note, venomous snakes tend to have vertical slits, and non-venomous snakes tend to have circular pupils. But I wouldn't recommend getting close enough to a snake to check to see if you can see the vertical slits, because if it is a venomous snake, it's probably too late. But anyway, so those are the different types of pupils that can be found, and I'll do one little demonstration later where we'll do something fun where we'll kind of mix a human eye with a cat's eye. A good general rule of thumb, something that's fun to remember, is that eyes in front like to hunt, eyes on the side like to hide. So if the eyes are on the side of the head, they probably have monocular vision. They're probably prey animals, and they would like to hide. If the eyes are on the front, they would like to hunt. More oftentimes than not, they are predators, but there are cases where they also can be ambush predators, and their pupils can actually have vertical slits. So getting back to now just talking today about the human eye, first thing I would like to go over is the front view. So something that's very helpful, when you draw somebody's portrait from across a room, or you're looking at somebody's face from across the room, something that's very interesting with the human face is that we have the ability to see if somebody's looking directly at us, looking to the side. We can tell if somebody's paying attention when we're talking to them, because humans have what is known as the sclera, which is the white of the eye. So in here, this would be the area that would be the white of the eye. The eye is basically a sphere. So this is the white of the eye. Then we have the iris, which is the colored portion. And then we have the dark section that's in the center, and that is the pupil. There's a lot more complex anatomy to the eye that we won't get into today. We'll just cover the basics. But basically, the white is the sclera, the colored portion is the iris, and the pupil is the dark portion in the middle, and that adjusts to allow light in, and that is controlled. It can expand and contract in the environment depending on how much light is available. So the eye itself is basically a sphere, and we can see here's the sphere in profile, and then it would come back, and that's the optic nerve that comes to the back. And we'll go over the profile eye in just a minute. But the front view, so then once we have this round ball of the eye, then we add in here our iris and then the pupil. When we put the eyelids over the cross, over the top of this, we want to make sure that it goes over and wraps around the ball. So the eyelids need, and that's the orbicularis oculi, and we have to make sure that these muscles of the eyelids wrap around the ball, the sclera portion of our eyeball. So this is usually always higher on the inside, lower on the outside. So I showed this angle here. So you can see the inside should be higher. The outside, this third, is the lowest part, and then it comes back up in here. This is the high point here, and then it drops down here. Then right in here is our pupil, and then right here is the iris. This section in here is the white of the eye. And you want to think that there's a little bit of a lip. So let me add this lip, because there's a slight plane on the top of our eyelid that light can actually fall on. And then we have a thickness to the upper eye, so that we have this plane that comes out, down, and then it wraps around the eye, and it comes out and down. So we have these planes of the eye. So I'll go right here, down, wraps around the ball of the eye, comes out and down. And then this on the other side, we can go here the other way, comes out, down, wraps around the ball of the eye through here, goes out and down. So those are the kind of the planes of the eye that are important. When we're shading, that would disappear. So, and an interesting note, this section in here is always the darkest portion. When we look at somebody's face across from the room, typically the darkest thing that we'll see in the face is the eyes. The mouth, the nose, the cast shadows, everything will not be as dark as the iris and the pupil. So we're gonna put a tone on all of this. You should never leave this white or light. And then the pupil should be darker. So just very briefly darken that in. And light typically comes from above. So it's important to note that the top portion of the eye should always fall into shadow. So I want to make sure I very quickly put a shadow on the whole top portion of the eye. As the eye starts to wrap underneath, it also will have a tone. So it's just a quick intro to shading here. And let me darken that, darken that. This portion, this plane of the upper eyelid, the thickness here has a tone, and we have reflected light underneath, if you remember from our shading activities, and then we have a cast shadow, so it needs to be darker, onto the upper portion of the iris, darker here. And then when we get to the eyelid, light will fall up here in this top portion. And let me lighten that line where I showed the planes before, because that'll be distracting now. So now we want to put a little bit of a tone, because we want the light to fall on this top portion of the eyelid. We have a tone as it fades away. The lower eye falls into shadow. And usually, depending on the age, there might be some wrinkles in there. In the tear duct here, there's a little bit of a dark area. And then we have a little bit of a shadow underneath the eyelid through here. The upper eyelid goes over, and it gets darker as it goes back in behind the eyelids. And then there's a little bit of a cast shadow here from the brow, and the side plane of the nose would be in here as well. But we're not going to get to that today. We're just going to focus on the eye. So here we go. All this section is going to be dark. And the edge of the iris, because it isn't completely flat, will have a little bit of a tone. A little bit of a tone in here. And then let me just lighten a small little area right here, because right on the edge, it's important to note that the eye is always moist. It is not dry, so you want to have the kind of a glassy film in the highlight. So let me just erase some of this because I want to put a highlight in here. So right in here where the eyelid meets the iris, there's usually a small, very thin highlight. It's particularly important for painting. And then this top section here, there's usually a highlight in here on the pupil and the iris. The little inner quarter, the tear duct, usually has a light white area, and then some of the sclera has a highlight. Now remember, we had the top of the eyelid is going to have a highlight, and this bottom plane, remember there's a thickness to this here, that's also going to have a highlight, and the tear duct in here is going to have a highlight. And so very quickly we can start to have a fairly realistic human eye. That give you an idea. So cast shadow here, and I can exaggerate this now a little bit more just to make it a little stronger. Make the pupil a little more defined. And if you want, you can, because there's a little bit of feathering that happens in here, so we can add a little bit of light in here if we want. And I'll do a time lapse where I'll actually shade a couple of these others using a tiny bit of color, just so that you can see how it would be with color added. And then we want to just darken in that corner right here and round it a little bit so that the eyelid comes in front and this top portion goes over the lower section. And you start to get the sense of a fairly realistic eye. So, and then I thought I'd do, so this is with the eye open. Notice that it slants. Remember, the high point is the inside third, the low point is on the outside third. So you don't want to make your low point over here, it would look funny. It would look like it was the other eye. So you want it to be lower on this one side. And remember, this eyelid wraps around. So the eyelid is a protective covering for the eye. So it has to have the capacity to open and to close over our eye. When we draw the eye closed, we have this same little tear duct area in here. We have this same section here. But then when the eye folds over here, it has to wrap around over the oval of our eye, over the ball of our eye. So this is now going to come in and then wrap around, because it's got to wrap around the ball, and then it ends here on the side. Then you want to show a thickness. You don't necessarily need to draw every single eyelash in here. There's no need for that, especially because when you're distance away, and I didn't include the eyelashes here. If we wanted to, we could have added some in here and so forth. But when you're drawing, and especially when you're painting portraits, unless you're doing hyper-realism or super photorealism, it's not necessary. Most classically trained artists never will put in and include the eyelashes. When you're painting portraits, or if you're drawing it, even if you're at the dinner table and you look across the room, and if somebody's a good 10 feet away from you or so, you can't actually see their eyelids. Or not their eyelids, their eyelashes. So it's not particularly an important thing to do when you're drawing and painting the eyes. Just focus on getting the anatomical structure correct, because you want it to be recognizable, obviously, as an eye. So now we have the sphere, so I want to shade this in a way, and this tends to be right here. You'll have a little fold where it wraps around, and then there's a little area before that can have a little bit of a fold in here. And the highlight's going to be somewhere in here. If the light source is coming from this side, the highlight's going to be somewhere in there. So this is all going to have a tone. And all of that side's going to fall into shadow, very much like shading the sphere. And then we would have the eye, the orbit of the eye would be casting a shadow up in here. But that's not necessary at this point. So core shadow, remember you got to have your core shadow, and then the reflected light, and then we want a little bit of light right on the top, and we're going to show a thickness here, which could be the eyelashes, but it also shows a thickness with the fleshy fold. And then there's a little bit of the bone structure that would come in here. So we'll just show some of that so we know that it's inside the eye socket. And the inner eye, this inner eye area is known as the, usually referred to as the acanthus. So we'll show that here and in here. And now I'll put a little highlight, kind of subtle through there. A little highlight in here. I'm going to have it kind of go to a few of the folds of the skin that would be over this. And we'd probably have a fold in here. And maybe a little bit down under in here. And then, so that's around that just a little bit more here. So it looks a little more natural. Okay, so eye open, and this is the eye closed. And again, let's just very quickly. So again, we have, this is if we were to remove the eyelid, this is more or less what it would look like from the front view. And if I have light coming from this side, I would have this section in here would fall into shadow, just like when we're shading a sphere. And this would have a little bit of a tone here. And this would be darker in here. And we'll have the core shadow come through here. And everything underneath is reflected light. So remember, all this white portion is known as the sclera. This portion in here is the iris. And actually, let's, just for fun here, let's put a little color in there. So, and we'll add a little blue. So the iris is the portion of the eye that has the color. And then from a painting perspective, usually because this top section will fall into shadow, most of the time when you paint, you would see the color in the lower section. So if you wanted to add a little color, you could add it just in that lower section. And I'll add color to these when I do them in a time lapse, just so you can get a sense of what that's like. And then let me darken in here the pupil. And we'll make that a little darker right through here. And this lower section of the eye. Core shadow with reflected light. And I'm going to make, just to demonstrate that we know that this needs to be, it's kind of wet, so we'll exaggerate here, kind of like the eye is a melting icicle here. So now we've got this nice little highlight right here on the pupil. I'm going to have it light coming from above on this side, so I'll have it come off into here. So that's all highlight. I'm going to put a little bit of light in this lower section of the iris. And then, where this is dripping, let's add a little bit of reflected light under here. And a little highlight in here, some reflected light under there. So it kind of looks a little bit like it's water. And I'll clean this up and make it look a little better when I do the time lapse. I'll clean it up. And then just some reflected light in here to show the wet. Oops. And we can use a little bit of the, enhance the dark in here of the pupil. So anyway, that kind of gives you an idea of this section here is the white of the eye, the sclera. And let's just put a highlight on this side here because we'd have a highlight here. Then we have the iris and we have the pupil, and it's all covered by the cornea. And then this here is just a fun little drip that we have so that we can see that the eye is wet. And here's where the eyeball is dripping off there. There we go. A little reflected light under there. Reflected light in here. A little light in the iris there on this side. A little that feathering just to try to make it look a little more realistic. And a little highlight on the edge of the iris where this meets the sclera, because it's a little bit of a flattened surface. A little bit of a flattened surface here. And then a nice, good highlight through here. So that's kind of, now you can see how we have the coloration of the iris, the pupil, without the eyelid. All right, here we did the eye with just the two colors, the highlight and the sepia. And now let's very quickly just talk briefly here about how to draw an eye in profile. I always recommend, and I think it's by far the easiest way to remember how to do an eye in profile, is to do a capital letter A. So if you do a capital letter A and turn it on its side, as you can see right here, here's one leg, here's the other leg, and here is the middle. If I had the eye turned the other way, I would have the eye go like this, and then I'd put the line that runs through for the middle of the A. So here, right here, we can see, here is the A. Here is the A, and here is my middle line. Now this middle line here, remember the eye turned on its side, just like it here, it's a sphere. So we want to make sure that we have a sphere through here. And I have that in here. And then here's the optic nerve going back. The eyelids have to extend beyond this portion of the eyeball. The eye has to wrap down and close to protect the eye. So this has to, these have to extend out beyond. Always make sure that you extend beyond. And then this should be slightly rounded. You don't want to make it perfectly straight. And then we just make an ellipse. So if I turn this here and I round it a little bit, and I round this a little bit and make an ellipse, then we know that it's an eye. This is the iris, and right here in the section is a smaller ellipse, and that is the pupil. Then the upper eyelid is here, and here we have that plane with reflected light, so we want to make sure that we extend this out for shading purposes. And then this whole section in here is going to cover that eye. Remember, the eyelid has to go over the ball. So this is going over the ball. And then our lower lid comes out the same and comes to here and goes back. And then we have a little bit of shading here under this side plane. So I'll put a light tone here so we can see that. Remember, the upper lid casts a shadow into the whole top section of the eyeball. And we want that to sit back in that cavity. And then This is so that you can see this angle, that the eyelid has to be able to wrap over the eye. The eyelid has to go over the eye. The eyelid has to be able to wrap over the eyelid. So this can close down on top of this. And that's how you basically, what you need to do to draw the eye in profile. So and then remember here we have this top section. We'll probably have a bit of a highlight on it. So I'm gonna try to include that. Remember, the highlight doesn't go on the very edge. The light has to remain within the form. So we need to have a soft turn in here on this edge. And obviously I have some of these lines darker because I'm trying to show that so you can see how that goes over. But then the eyelids would probably come in here. And the eyelashes would be on there. And in here, same, this goes under, and this comes down toward the maxilla. And as the eye comes to the side, we have a tone. Because remember, the light stays on top of the form, on top of the sphere, the ball. And same underneath here, we have a tone. And it gets darker in the corner of the eye. And then we would have a little bit of a highlight probably in here, right there. And there a little bit of remember the eye's wet, so there's a little bit of moisture that runs right down the bottom there, and a little bit of light on the lower plane of the eyelid. And that's more or less the eye in profile. So just keep in mind, and I left it here real simple so you can clearly see the A. We have the A, the line, and the A. And that right here would be, the top lid would have highlight in there, some light in here, and a little bit of light on this section in here. So if you just have a capital letter A turned on the side, you get a hint of an actual eye. So you'll always have a pretty effective eye if you can just learn to keep that in mind when you're drawing the head and profile. Let me soften that a little bit there. And be a little bit lighter on that outside. And if we wanted to do the sphere, we can just put a light tone over this really quickly, just to push it back. Core shadow where it goes under. The optic nerve, reflected light, a little bit of a tone. So we can have cast shadow from here, reflected light. And add a highlight on the top part. Highlight in here. Okay, and let's get a better highlight in this lower lid. There we go. So that kind of sums up the eye. The main thing you need to keep in mind is the iris and the pupil always need to be darker. Make sure they're always the darkest thing you see on the face. Otherwise, you'll be, obviously, if you're doing a fantasy character and you want the person to be an albino, that would be different. But most people, when you're doing portraits, won't be doing that. And then make sure this is always darked in. Make sure you always put a shadow, a cast shadow from the upper eyelid. There always has to be a cast shadow from here onto the whole top portion of the eye. If you were going to add color and you were painting, the color would be most likely to be seen in the lower portion, especially when you're doing a portrait of somebody from a slight distance. You can add eyelashes in here if you choose, but most of the time when you're doing portraiture, it's a distraction and it won't look right. So it's better to just make sure that the eye is drawn very well and they get all the anatomical structure in there, and especially focus on your highlights and making it feel like it has moisture and it has kind of a glassy texture to it. And that makes it look like it has a wet surface, and that's one of the most fun parts about drawing the eye, is getting that glassy, unique, wet look. All right, so I will do a time lapse on this, and I will shade the last two eyes, but very quickly, just so this I'll do a regular realistic eye, but I'll add color like I did in here. So I'll add a bluish tint into the iris and try to make that a little more finished. This one I'll add some, I'll make it a little bit more cat-like. So I'll use the vertical slit that you would find in a small cat, which would make it an ambush predator. And this is going to have two pupils. In the fantasy world, there's something that could be done that was known as pupilla duplex, which is if you had a weird genetic trait where you were born with two pupils. It doesn't exist in nature, but if it did, this may be a way in which it would look. And I will do that, making one human eye, one cat eye, and I will change it to a lighter color and try to do kind of a finished fantasy version combining eyes and pupils that may exist in nature. So with that, let me move this forward and we'll do the time lapse.